Good evening. I'm Julie Varghese, Chief Operating Officer here at the Atlantic Council. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight to host Michael Sheldrick and our esteemed panel to talk about his new book, From Ideas to Impact, a playbook for influencing and implementing change in a divided world. I first met Michael in 2017 when the Atlantic Council partnered with Global Citizen on some programming during UN General Assembly Week. And over the years, I've been really fortunate to work with Michael and count him as a friend and colleague, and it only made sense to host him here in Washington, D.C. for his book talk. Driven by our mission of shaping the global future together, the Atlantic Council is a nonpartisan organization that galvanizes U.S. leadership and engagement in the world, working together with allies and partners to shape solutions to global challenges. Our president and CEO, Fred Kemp, often shares with staff Margaret Mead's celebrated quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has." Mick is a tireless advocate and changemaker. As co-founder of Global Citizen, he's worked with governments, corporations, foundations, artists, and everyday citizens to distribute over $40 billion around the world in the past decade. He's taken this experience, translated it, and has created a guidebook for those interested in implementing social impact by driving policy change. In a divided world, his 8-step playbook equips readers with the tools to craft impactful narratives, reinforcing that actual change begins with us as individuals. Before I turn it over to Michael, I'd like to introduce a video message from artist and UN Goodwill Ambassador, Sabrina Dalray Elba.
Hey everyone, my name is Sabrina Dalray Elba, and I'm so excited for the launch of my friend Michael Sheldrick's book, Ideas to Impact. I just know that this book is going to resonate with so many people as a simple 8-step guide to really see real systemic change in this world and how to make a difference. On my philanthropic journey, Mick did just that for me. He not only reminded me with his glass half full Aussie smile that there's hope in this world, but that we could really be the drivers of that change. If you have the will, then there is a way. And I needed someone to remind me that it takes passion to see change. And he has done that in his career and has shown so much passion time and time again, whether it be through the sacrifices he's made with his family and Wendy, or the times that he's really just gone out on a limb to speak to whoever he needed to speak to and show up in the rooms that he had to be in. And that's had such an impact on me. In fact, it would be an understatement to not think that it has truly shaped who I am today. So I'm forever thankful to you, Mick, and I know the book is going to be amazing. And to everyone here who's going to read it, I can't wait for you to enjoy it. So good luck, Mick.
And thank you for that message, Sabrina. And without further ado, I introduce to you Michael Sheldrick.
Well, thank you, Julie. And also, I really want to give a shout out to Lauren and the whole team at the Atlantic Council for putting me on. When I asked if you might host a book talk, I was kind of happy with just a small room, maybe around a table with some friends, and you went all out, and I really appreciate that, and I'll make sure I repay the favor, but thank you so much. It's very kind. And I want to thank everyone for coming to this kickoff of the book. You see, when I started writing this book, to give some perspective why I started writing this is obviously we know right now the world, we look around, it's a dispirited place, and we know right now we're heavily divided, it's polarized. But beneath the radar, when we look at, and surveys show this, when we look at public opinion polls, when we look at communities around the world, we actually still see that a majority of citizens actually still identify as global citizens. We see a majority of citizens that actually care about the bold policies that are needed in the world. And we see actually beneath the radar, many communities bringing about change. And so when I wrote this book, was really inspired by the fact that over the years, as we grew Global Citizen, and people would say, wow, you guys are really amazing, you're changing the world. I would often get these messages from high school students, university students, members of Rotary clubs, sometimes leaders of institutions here in DC, sometimes leaders of marginalized communities, sometimes leaders of communities in vulnerable situations. And they were all asking for help, or they were asking for advice on how to launch their own campaigns. And initially, whenever I would get that question, can you give me advice? I was unsure of how to answer that question. And the reason why I was always unsure is it triggered a memory from, and this is going to sound weird, and I promise you it has a point to it, but it would trigger a memory of my first year at high school in Australia. And Australians love our sport. We absolutely adore our sporting heroes, but sometimes it's a little bit intimidating if you're that bookish, shy, nerdy kid who isn't good at sport, seen as a loser. Sometimes it's a little bit intimidating. And I would always remember this one particular memory. You know, we play Aussie rules in Australia, which is kind of like Gaelic football in Ireland. And I would walk out onto the football pitch, and I would have the football, and I would sense all these eyes on me, all the other kids in the class looking at me intently. And I remember just thinking, please God, I just want to kick this ball. I don't even want to score a goal. I'm happy to miss a goal. I just want to miss like a normal kid and just completely ordinary kick of the ball. And of course, you know, with all these eyes, the intensity on me, I would kick this ball, something weird would happen, it would fly off in the opposite direction, people would laugh. And then we would go into this high school assembly, and the motivational speakers was always some kind of sporting legend. It was always like either an Olympian, a gold medalist, it was a trophy-winning footballer, and they would talk about how great and wonderful they were and the advice that they were giving us for us to mark our own paths as future budding sporting legends. And I always remember sat there thinking, well, that's okay for you to talk about. You've already done this, but how can I possibly relate to in any way this story? The gap seemed so big. And so when I was getting these inquests from people asking for help, I never wanted the answer to be, or people to think, that they had to go out and establish their own organization. And I was always conscious that now they could look at Global Citizen, and I didn't want them to think, well, okay, you've done all of that. You've built this organization, you've got all these team members, you're mobilizing millions of citizens, because I felt that was deeply disempowering. And so in writing the book, it was really my attempt, and it's not a book about Global Citizen, that features in there, but it's more my attempt to distill over the last decade and a half the incredible campaigners, advocates I've met, and who I call policy entrepreneurs, in 8 simple principles. 8 simple principles to give people a start to chart their own campaigns, to start making a difference, whether you're a cultural icon like Taylor Swift, a business leader, or an everyday citizen. It's a place for people to begin. One of my heroes is Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the first US ambassador to the UN, co-author of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and she famously said, and I have this magnet on my fridge at home, the way to begin is to begin. So I hope in that spirit the book gives people a place to get started, because I genuinely believe in an era of division and mistrust, when we look to our friends and family and we can see them making a difference and we can see the positive responses to our action, the best way to motivate people, the best antidote to apathy and indifference is action. And I want to share just one of the stories. The book has multiple stories of many communities, and I promised, I got some representatives. Alexandria kindly hosted me at Johns Hopkins last night for a discussion with some of the students there, and I promised that I wouldn't tell the same story twice, maybe one, but this next story I'm going to tell, I think few people have heard about it, and it's definitely not a Global Citizen story, but when I was writing the book, one of the big challenges that I was conscious of, if we're to address climate change, we have to transition to renewables, to clean energy. We have to shift our economies, but we have to do so in a way that brings communities along, bring affected workers along. And I was very conscious that if we failed to do that, we would spark a backlash. And so I went around the world and I was looking for an example of a successful example of policy entrepreneurship in action, successful example of where this transition had begun. And it was actually a community in Australia. And believe it or not, close to where I'm from, Perth, Western Australia. And I had the opportunity to visit this community. And the reason why this community stood out to me is often in many parts of the world, when there's a transition, away from coal, oil, or gas. Often there's this tension between workers, trade unions, governments trying to shift this transition. And what was unique about this town that had been dependent on coal for more than a century, is it was actually the workers themselves and the trade unions that was at the forefront of leading this transition. And so I went out and I met with one of the union leaders and I said, can you tell me the story of this transition? And he told me this story. He said, well, look, back in 2007, he said, I knew the writing was on the wall. I watched Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, and I knew where the dialogue was headed, and I knew then that there was a deadline on coal. And I knew in our history of this community, whenever the coal mines had closed, power plants had closed, it was the workers who abruptly were left with nothing. And I thought we needed to get ahead of this. So he goes, I convened a town hall, we got the community together, and all the workers in a venue like this, and he said, told them, he said, we have to plan for a transition, an age, a life of this community beyond coal. Well, you can imagine how that went down. Silence. One of the workers gets up and he says, Steve, with the greatest of respect, you don't understand this town. When a baby boy is born in this town, he gets two things. The first is he gets his mother's milk. The second is he gets a lump of coal in his hand. We're not transitioning away from coal. Suddenly Steve told me, recounting the story, how everyone started cheering. He said, that's when I knew I was losing the audience. And then so he decided to leave, and he said as he was leaving, the audience actually parted like, fish. And he went out, and then as soon as he closed the door, he could hear him saying, that guy over there, thinking he's saying all that. He said 5 years later, when the government started talking about the economic infeasibility of coal and coal-fired power generation, suddenly the community came back to him like he was, in his words, like he was Nostradamus. And they invited him in, and they began this community transition. And he said two things. He said, we knew that it had to be community-led, not just the workers. He said, we knew it had to be about keeping this community alive. And he said, because when it's led by government, that's when it doesn't work. And I won't go into what happened, the in and outs, because you have to buy the book if you haven't and read it. But I will tell you the end of the story. The end of the story is May 2022. The Premier, or the Governor of the state of Western Australia, who's like this populist type of figure, has a supermajority in the Parliament. He's journeying to this town. And we're more than a third of the jobs all dependent on coal. And he only wants to go to one place, a coal power plant. And he goes, I want to see all the workers and I want them to hear the news first. And he stands up like this and he tells them, the end of coal, the last power plant in this town that's powered this state for more than 100 years will close in 4 years' time. And Steve, who's standing out the back, says it is a moment, a day he will never forget because of what happened next. One person at the audience started clapping, and all of the workers burst out in stunned applause. The reason why that was successful, the reason why the community embraced that announcement is because they had also just paired it with the largest, with the announcement of the largest battery storage in the Southern Hemisphere that would create hundreds of jobs for this town. And how they got there, again, read the book, and I'll give you a hint. Although they did think about getting on a plane and flying to Texas to meet with Elon Musk, they went far simpler routes in the end. But Steve said to me, he said, just transitions, they don't work if they're not just. That's why. But he said they can work, and we set out to build a blueprint. A lot of people have asked me, and there's many stories like Steve's in the book, and there's many stories like that I try and pinpoint, well, what's the key principles? People have said, why did you come up with policy entrepreneurship? And really where policy entrepreneurship came from was when I was at university, and we were starting to found Global Citizen. I'll be honest with you, we didn't know if we was going to be successful. We had put in all these grants, but here in America, and we've got representative foundations here, they were like, yeah, we don't care what you've done in Australia. Unless you've done it in America, it didn't happen. So we had no idea, which is a typical experience in philanthropy. But fortunately, not with Open Society Foundation. So I had applied for all these. I was like, should I study? I applied for these masters. And it was in the process of applying for one of these masters in these interviews. I had no idea if I was going to get in. I was trying to explain what was building at Global Citizen. And this lecturer turned around and said to me, oh, so you're basically a policy entrepreneur. And in the back of my mind, now the good news is those grants were successful. We came to New York, we established Global Citizen, and the rest was history. But that term policy entrepreneur stayed in the back of my mind. And one last story, when I was finishing the book, you know, again, I'm conscious, divided, polarized. You know, I after getting the deal to write this book and distilling all of this down, shortly after that, we found out my wife was pregnant with our first daughter. And there's nothing like the pending birth of a child to motivate one to get the book done, because I realized I wouldn't have much time afterwards. So I rushed through to complete this book. And honestly, I poured my heart and soul. I didn't take sabbatical, was leaving several campaigns. I did it on the subway, on Google Docs, did it on the plane, did it on a boat, just to bash this thing out. I submitted it 7 a.m. in the morning on November 9th. Our daughter was due to be born on November 30th. And as I submitted it, and I did tell this story last night, but I got this phone call from my mum. My mum's an aged care worker back in Australia. And she said, there's someone here who has just been admitted, you might remember. And she started to talk about, remember the guy, Len? I said, Len, the old guy with the 2 walking sticks, he had a dog called Tramp because he literally looked like the dog from Lady and the Tramp. He said, yeah, that Len. I said, but he must have been like 88 or something. And that was 20 years ago when I was a high school student walking my dog, Shenton. She goes, yeah, he's 105. He's still around. And he remembers you. And I'm telling him what you've done in New York, and he wants to speak to you. So my mum said, have you got time? So there I was, FaceTiming with Len, because I had this week between like waiting for our birth of our daughter, submitting the manuscript, and I FaceTimed with Len. Len was born in 1917. He got married in 1939, actually Remembrance Day, 1939. He then went to, as the war broke out, this was in the UK, he went to France. And he was explaining to me how, as the Nazis were coming down over France, he was explaining to me how they were all fleeing, trying to get to the port, and there he was, climbing a hill. And he said as he was climbing the hill, he'd never forget this, he was looking down at the grass, and a great shadow came up over the grass. And he said he looked up, and there were 200 German planes above him. And he thought, that was it, I'm a goner. But it was just him, and the planes flew over. And so he ran round, went to this village, and he said, I saw this American car, and I went, you beauty. I got in the car, sped to this port, the port of Calais. He got on the last boat leaving France as it was falling to the Nazis. And then when he arrived, his superior officer said, I need you to go to this town. You're the only soldier. Rally the villagers because Germans might be parachuting. So he arrived just as Germans were parachuting over this town in the southeast of England. And he said he got the villagers, he got their pitchforks, and they went down to meet them. And I said, Len, when, at that moment, when France was falling, when Europe was being taken over, did you think it was over? Like, how did you maintain hope? Did you, like, think literally that was the end? And he said to me, he said, no. We said to ourselves, we haven't got much, but we're not running away. We'll give it a go. We're not running away. We'll give it a go. You know, our daughter was born a week earlier, November 20th, and 2 weeks after that was December 6th, and that was Len's 106th birthday. He said to his daughter, that's it, I've given it my all. It's on to others to give it a go. And he passed away in his sleep. And I think about that moment, and I think about today, And in some ways, we have so much more. We have so much at our fingertips to be policy entrepreneurs, to make a difference. And the question which I pose at the end of the book to us is, are we willing to give it a go? What can we do? And I know the answer, and I think the rest of us in this room do, and I hope with this book it motivates others to also give it a go. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Abdalkhani, Chief Catalyzer and founder of Ability to Engage, where we help people feel understood through deep audience engagement, strategy, innovation, and conversations such as today. I have the honor of being able to moderate what I think will be a very lovely and lively discussion today with Kizito, Byenkya, Alexandria, Maloney, and Sanjayan. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.
So one of the things that I wanted to mention as well is that their bios are online. I usually like to read bios, but theirs are so impressive that it would take our full 20 minutes, okay? So please do take a look online to learn about all of the experiences our panelists have had. I'd like to start out with you, Kizito, about the 8 principles in Michael's book. What in that book resonated with you the most and why?
Thank you. Thank you for that, and thank you for this fantastic discussion. And I'm very happy to be discussing the book, Ideas to Impact, because in how Mick set it out in the book, before we get to the 8 principles, there's an infrastructure before that that's looking at where he articulates the visionary, the diplomat, as well as the implementer. I like to call it vision, diplomacy, and implementation. And that infrastructure is what gives you those 8 principles. And so I'll take one principle from each of those three places of infrastructure, because that really is the blueprint in my mind in how you take forward ideas to action and to impact. And so one of the ones that really jumped out at me when we look at vision in terms of setting out goals, setting out the plan, where you're able to take that work, is having clear, articulate goals, setting clear policy goals. And so in the book, it's described as know your policy goal, be clear, and follow those SMART objectives. SMART, being specific, measurable, achievable, and so on. This is something that's very compelling to me because it's something in how we organize, for example, our work at my foundation, in that you need to have a clear outline and blueprint in where you want to go. But it's not just about having that kind of clarity. It's also being specific and developing the goals in a way where you can be able to measure that over time and know where you're going. To give you an example, early on, when the pandemic hit, a lot of us had a response around the pandemic. We were looking at the early time was to see how we can get more vaccine access around the world. One of the initial goals, one of the campaigns back then was to see if we can get 70% of the world vaccinated. Big amorphous goal. Soon, within a few months, it became very clear that most of the global north, that's where the vaccine access was taking place. And instead, throughout the global south, you had very limited access. For example, at one point, Africa, I think, had 6%, whereas you had, let's say, in Europe and North America, somewhere closer to 50%. And so that goal of 70% of a vaccination rate wasn't that effective when you're looking at a global solution to the problem. Rather, you had to be more specific to be able to identify exactly how you're going to address this global issue in a way where you can be able to distill how it's developing region by region, but also that's where you can be able to get to the right outcomes that we needed at that time. That's also almost looking back to seeing what we could have done better. Another principle that I really like is when we look at the second bit, which is about diplomacy. And so there's this piece where he's looking at leveraging partners' strengths. That's important also to our work, especially as a foundation, because a motto I always go with is teamwork makes the dream work. It might sound a little bit cheesy, but it really is, and that's what you really need, a community of support to be able to take forward the goals at the end of the day. And so for foundations like us, we work with partners, grantees across the globe who are able to take forward actions on a wide range of issues. It's not enough to do it alone. You need that kind of partnerships to be able to do so. And so, to give you the same example in terms of that pandemic response, that was a global response. It's not enough for one partner to take that forward, but it's also important to have critical friends who can tell you where you're going wrong and where you can course correct. So for example, our African friends rightly raised the alarm that look at what you're doing. This is not a global approach to the problem. Rather, it's a rich country approach to the problem. And then one other one that jumped out to me, which is on the implementation side, that's knowing your end game. So let's say you have a campaign, where are you going to stop? if it's legal routes, how long will that take? If it's non-legal routes, what are the different tactics that you're taking forward where you feel that they'll be effective? Because often we get into a problem, we get into an issue, and we just keep going. Because at the end of the day, there's more things that pop up, more things to be able to take on, and it's hard to look back at the original insight of where you were trying to take forward your work. And so one of the ways that we designed our campaigns at Open Society originally was to have those campaigns be time-bound for 2 years. Very difficult, very tricky, but it lets you know that this is your end game, that you're planning towards a series of actions towards that. Of course, the campaigns could be extended, but then you know that you're taking forward these time-bound actions to achieve success over time.
Well, thank you so much for sharing some of those specific examples. I feel like it really helps bring it to life in terms of what he's written in his book and how that's really implemented in your work as well. Related to that, Sanjayan, I wanted to ask you, as CEO of Conservation International, I feel like there's a lot of parallels between your work and the work that Michael does. And I was wondering if there are some common threads between your work and Michael's.
Sure, and thank you for having me here. And first and foremost, buy this book. It's fantastic. If you already have one, give it to a friend or a colleague. It's a great playbook. So, we work in the Global South, exclusively in the Global South. And our mission is simple. We try to protect nature for people. So the link between people and protecting nature for climate, or oceans, or linking production with protection, those are all really done in design of creating jobs and creating opportunity for people, particularly in the Global South. I would say the most important thing I would say that I kind of reflected on as I read through his book is, we're in a remarkable moment right now when you're right, the world isn't agreeing on anything. We're divided on every cause you can imagine. We're divided by race, by nationality, by religion, by ideology, by identity. I mean, the list goes on. But one thing is kind of amazing. Last year in Montreal, you had 192 countries come together to agree to protect 30% of the oceans and land, in the next 30 years, essentially. That was kind of an amazing thing. I mean, you got Ukraine and Russia, you got China and the United States, you got the last two holdouts, believe it or not, like down to the wire, like everyone else had agreed, like the last two holdouts were DRC and Rwanda. Right? DRC and Rwanda holding out right to the bitter end. But you got them all to get that agreement. The same thing at COP26, at COP27. I mean, the fact that we got fossil fuels in there, in that language about a reduction in fossil fuels, kind of a remarkable thing to get that kind of agreement by petrostates like Saudi Arabia not objecting to it. In fact, the next COP is going to be in Azerbaijan, and you had to get basically Armenia to agree to it. Bitter enemies, it was almost like a peace dividend. They at the final moment agreed that the next COP would be in Azerbaijan. Why I'm saying all of this, we also have the High Seas Treaty that 77 countries agreed to. In a moment when the world is completely divided, we have unbelievable agreement that nature, climate, is crucially important to everyone. I am stunned that you can get countries that are so ideologically opposed still agree. Even in this country, last couple of weeks ago, a bill passed the Foreign Affairs Committee 2 weeks ago that was called the U.S. Foundations Bill. It's a bill to create funding for international conservation. It's basically to be a global citizen, for the United States to be a global citizen, essentially on the idea of conservation. Bipartisan, through Foreign Affairs Committee. Last week, you know what was going on last week in Foreign Affairs? I mean, that's sort of, to me, stunning. So your timing couldn't be more perfect. You've basically given us a playbook to take advantage of this big tent moment, to bring people together from different walks of life. It's almost as if companies and governments have almost agreed that what we've been going on about for 30 years is correct. Now it's up to us to create the steps in order to get policy or in order to have impact, in order to go from ideas to impact. I mean, the last thing I would say is that no one should read this book thinking, if I follow these 8 steps or how, if I go through this, my attempt will be successful. What you should use it for is to have the courage to attempt crazy stuff. There's a fantastic line from the movie industry that sort of hits what you have between flops. And in some ways, Michael's writing about the things that work. So he's not writing about all the things that, from an artist not showing up the last minute to, governments walking away from it to Kevin Rudd being late today, right? Today, at something you were supposed to go and introduce him at. So stuff happens in the world, and I think what this should give you, if you were in baseball analogy, for an American audience here, I'm gonna switch from Australian Gaelic rule football, which didn't really help anyone, to something a little more. So if you hit 1 out of 3, right, you're in the Hall of Fame. If you can hit 1 out of 3 out of the ballpark, you're in the Hall of Fame. So we should be aiming for that kind of hit rate in the nonprofit space, in the foundation space, and what you should use this is as a guide to give you courage to try those crazy ideas in a systematic way to get it out there.
Love that. Thank you. Just a few commonalities. Right, yeah. between you and Michael's work. Well, I want to go back to something that Michael touched upon in his opening remarks, which was this idea of policy entrepreneurship. He mentioned his professor had actually kind of put that seed in his head. And Alexandria, I'm wondering for you, what does policy entrepreneurship mean, and why do you think it's crucial at this moment?
Thank you, Ida, and thank you, Michael, because really you've given folks who may not even have what I consider to be the access to this kind of information, the blueprint, right? And so there's power in that, in sharing this knowledge and this wisdom. So I want to lift you up and thank you for that, as well as your partnership in this work. And so how I personally define policy entrepreneurship is where you have innovative, non-traditional strategies that are influencing society, that may be creating opportunities, and that may be supporting desired policy outcomes. And so when I think of policy entrepreneurs, particularly role models that I may think of in women, I think of Greta Thunberg, I think of Malala, I think of Eleanor Roosevelt, I think of Princess Rima Al Saud, women who are all taking a very creative approach in how they are revolutionizing policy and movement in their countries and among international stakeholders. And so when I really think about the community that I lead, which is Black professionals in international affairs, we do that in a number of ways, whether it's from encouraging and empowering our younger members, high school and college, on the things that matter to them, that are important to them, whether it's through our mid-careers and our senior careers, through our Colin Powell Leadership Institute, for example. And to me, what being a policy entrepreneur boils down to is having to understand not only the what of the policy that you're trying to change, but the how, right? How are we making these movements happen? And for me, that comes down to a fundamental ability to be able to challenge the status quo, right? And so that looks like asking who has a seat at the table, who built the table, what grounds, what truths is this table standing on? And what would it take to uproot some of those truths as well? And so I think that is what is at the heart of being a policy entrepreneur is.
Alexandria, I love something that you just touched on here at the end, which the what and the how. And an important piece, of course, is also the why, which is something that Michael touches upon in his 8 principles, the art of storytelling. And so, Sanjayan, I want to go back to you. I feel like you will have some really great examples of powerful stories. I'm wondering, maybe an example of when you were affected by a powerful story, or when you've been able to affect change yourself through powerful storytelling.
You know, when you read this book, you realize what a great storyteller, Michael is, and he saw that today, because the entire book is scattered with these really great stories of people he meets, and he somehow finds something great in them and do that. You know, for me, to be honest, a foundational story for me that I've often spoken about, which really had a major impact on my work and how I frame our work. You know, so I was born in Sri Lanka. I grew up in West Africa, but I was born in Sri Lanka. And when I was born, my grandmother took me to see an astrologer. And they read your kid's hair when you're a baby because they don't have fingerprints. And so they read my hair pattern and basically told my family that I would die by drowning. And I'm born on an island. We lived by the ocean. My grandmother comes and tells the whole family this, and so I'm not allowed in the ocean at all. And this is for 7 years, no ocean. We even didn't have no baths, so we installed one of the first showers in Colombo, those sorts of things.
Wow.
And then we moved to West Africa, and radical move there. And I learned to swim because my mother sort of broke with tradition and taught me how to swim in a pit that was built for mining. It's a mining pit for diamond mines, and it was what was left behind. So you couldn't see the bottom, there were frogs in the water. But that's how I learned to swim. Now, I mean, I've really gone diving in every ocean on the planet, and it's completely changed my life. Now, I've thought about that story for a long time, and I've even asked my mother why, and didn't have a great answer. I've asked my grandmother about it. No great answer. And it's taken me a long time to understand what was behind this. And really it came down to the way I see it, my grandmother knew how limited her time was with me. So all she tried to do was protect me. That's what you do when you love something and you just know you're limited, you put your arms around and you protect. My mother valued my life. She was actually investing in my future. She expected me to take care of her in some time in her life, as Asians and others do. And I think that investment in your life was what motivated her to try to do something for me that clearly put me at risk. And it wasn't the most prudent thing to do, but gave me that pathway forward. And the reason I tell that story is because it's exactly how I see what we do in the environment, what we do for nature. When we come at it from love alone and we say, I want to protect this place because I love it. And that's how E.O. Wilson talks about it. That's how Jane Goodall talks about it. That's how David Attenborough talks about it. And these are amazing communicators and storytellers, much better than any of us, much better than me. It's not enough. You also need to create value. And that's what makes it stick, particularly when you come to places in the global south, but here too, in Montana, in Tennessee, in Australia, in rural Australia, right? So you need both love and value if you're trying to make that stick. That's a foundational story. And I think what you do with your book, which I think is what makes this book powerful, is that you may not remember the steps, but you'll remember the small stories, and that prompts you to then think about it. And timing on these stories is everything, and you've got a great sense of that. So, I think most of us who are working in the nonprofit space have a core story that helps define us. And we need to be able to really hone that and be able to articulate it.
Beautifully stated. Thank you. And since you were never supposed to go in water, what is your favorite place that you've gone diving?
Raja Ampat, Indonesia.
Wow.
It's the birds at sea. It's the most biodiverse place on planet Earth, and it's one of those rare places that is better today than it was 20 years ago, which is a remarkable testament to the power of communities to motivate and to put things right.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. Well, you also mentioned the importance of timing. You talked about it from your grandmother's perspective and overall with storytelling and how well Michael does it in his book. And it's one of those 8 principles, mastering the art of timing. I'm wondering, Kizito, can you tell us about how that principle applies in your world?
Absolutely, and timing is so important. Could not underline that more, because any intervention that you take needs to be in the proper time, but also the proper overtone window, as Michael describes very well in his book, in order to take those actions forward. In fact, something that's most appropriate in terms of timing is everybody should buy Michael's book. But seriously, because seriously, because I think that's what he's trying to educate and teach us is how we can best organize for impact, and it lays out the right foundations, the right principles in order to do so. I like to think that we had great timing as Open Society when we became in partnership with Global Citizen, because it came at the right time when we were embarking on a series of campaigns, looking at the first time to see how we could do some more public advocacy work. And we had a partner who was well situated to be able to do so and help teach us in order to see how we can best take that forward. But also, this is their work, this is their business, and we were able to partner with them in the best way possible. So that was great timing. But just more on timing is that, going back to the overtone window, any campaign or any intervention needs to be situated in a specific context for success. And so this is where timing always comes in. In how we started a number of our campaigns was when we felt that there were certain wins, either in terms of a legislative win that's created space then for implementation and action, or let's say there was a certain policy reform or a certain coalition or community that's coming together, or even a movement that's pushing towards something. Last year, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights turned 75. Not many people know that, and I feel we could have done a lot much more with last year, but that created a great timing for many foundations to start thinking about, well, how are we going to take human rights forward in the next decade? You know, we've been speaking for a long time that human rights are disconnected. People feel that they're not connected with the elite institutions, or how Bretton Woods institutions honestly have evolved to see how they can take forward the human rights architecture of our world. But here we have this moment where we are at this anniversary, and people are coming to the forefront to demand what rights really matter to them. You know, economic rights, environmental rights, looking at the specter of AI and technology, and it's creating momentum to see what we can do for the future of human rights. And so for me, that's timing. Finding that right moment, finding the right constituency, and reading Michael's book.
Excellent. Well, one of the things that underlies, I think, a little bit of what you were talking about is engagement of various stakeholders. So I'd like to end with one final question here, Alexandria, for you. Can you provide an example of where you've been able to build a bridge where there was initially a gap with your various stakeholders?
Yes. That's such a timely question about bridge building, because again, we're just in a time where there's so much polarization and division. And I want us as a community and as a nation and as our communities to resist, to push back, to say, no, there are ties that bind us as communities, regardless of how we look, how we may think, what our day-to-day lives are. There are these ties that bridge us together in terms of that progression. And when I think about these binds, it points back to one of the principles in the book, embracing pragmatism. And so when I think of the work that BPIA is doing at the forefront of advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in the foreign affairs field, that also comes with sometimes having to make the hard decisions, or the reality sometimes that there may be concessions or compromises that one has to make in this work. And so the thought that comes to my mind when I think about that on the topic of things like human rights, these aren't easy topics, right? It's like, how can you compromise on someone's human rights? And I think about, from my personal ancestral history, right? My ancestors going to the table saying, as a daughter of the American South in the U.S., right? My ancestors going to the table saying, we want freedom, rights, voting, education, all of these things on the cusp of slavery, or we want nothing. It's all off the table. That's not a reality in these really complex, deeply entrenched challenges that we're trying to solve. And so I think that this concept is it's imperative to DEI work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I want to make sure that we also open it up to the audience for a few questions. We'll take just 2 or 3 questions for our panelists, and Michael will chime in as well. I do ask if you can please come up here so everyone can hear you. We have a mic up here. Anybody brave enough to come up here for a question? Yeah? We have somebody. Oh, we have a mic over there. Sorry, you do not have to come on stage. You've been saved. Yeah, if you want to come back up here, that'd be great. First question's always the hardest. Here we go. Okay, we got one brave soul.
My name's Andrea Soccorso, a friend of Mix and a friend of Global Citizens, down from New York for this and some other things. And my question is, Mick, I know you're trying to give us hope and you're trying to mobilize communities, but you've worked with a range of leaders as well. And I'm wondering what you're seeing in your conversations with them or Global Citizens Advocacy with leaders, or to the panel, which leaders are inspiring you, and what are some of the challenges that they're facing? Because some leaders are trying, and maybe more than others.
Yeah, it's a very good question, Andrea, and it's great to see you. And by the way, there's so many great friends here in the audience, and I'm really thrilled and delighted you've given your evening to come and hear me talk. Look, I always say, and I'm conscious we just had the big TED Talks in Vancouver, and their message is ideas are everything. And my view is, yes, ideas are everything, and it's also about the people who implement those ideas, right? What's the quote from Einstein or Steve Jobs? That you can have the good idea, but 99% is in the work of doing it, the implementation, turn and talk into action, ideas into impact. And in the book, and Kizito alluded to this, and you've been our partners on this journey, I have a chapter dedicated to Prime Minister Motley of Barbados and the Bridgetown Initiative and what that represents, because it's funny, just hearing you talk, Alexandria, on the one hand, she's this incredible leader that defines the reckoning by which we find ourselves in history. Literally, she's turned Barbados from a constitutional monarchy into a republic. She's campaigning for reparations in the Commonwealth, which is something we've spoken about recently. And yet, at the same time, she's also cast herself as a bridge builder, literally the Bridgetown Initiative. And I think when you look at what she's been able to do and the impact she's already had, in part, I remember her telling a gathering last year at the UN, everyone was coming with their policy solutions, their ideas, saying, we need to call for this, we need 100 billion for this, we need money for this, we need to put a tax on this. And she said, my friends, simplicity gets us to the end. If we go for everything at once, we will fail. And we've seen the impact of that. And you're sat next to my good friend Jill Wilkins at the World Bank, who's probably trying to hide and make sure, because she's someone I'm always messaging, especially right now. We do a lot with the World Bank, and she does a great job. But, last year we actually saw the impact of that, and we saw the World Bank actually stand up and say, we are going to do more for small island nations. And RJ Banga, in his 19th day in the job, literally responded and said, we are going to do more for climate change. We are going to do more for those small island nations on the front lines of climate change. And so I think, Mia Motley is one of them, but I also hold up those doing the very difficult work in our institutions. And I make the point in the book, and the World Bank's an example of them. Right now, of course, we could burn everything down and we could rebuild the institutions from scratch. And in the book, I talk about the difference between striving for utopia, which can sometimes be fanciful and, devoid of rendering any fruit at the end, versus this concept that I came across called optopia. And the idea behind optopia is, what is the optimum solution we can get right now? Because we don't get to choose the hand that is dealt with us, only what we do with the time that's given to us, right? And so in the book, I talk about how can we leverage our existing institutions, work with the right leaders to turn these ideas into impact. But I don't know if maybe some of our panelists want to weigh in as well. Any leaders?
I mean, I think it's a hard question right now. I think many of the leaders who really take bold stands that globally are recognized as leadership, they get pilloried at home. It's funny that the ones that really stand out usually lose elections. Yeah. Wow. I think President Macron is consistent in standing up on stage and talking about these issues. Record is always tricky and mixed, but he's consistently there. He speaks. I think Ajay Banga, let's see. I mean, he's such a refreshing sort of leader. Jacinda Ardern is phenomenal. But, you go down that list and, there's a lot more leaders from the global south. Colombia has had an interesting record of having multiple presidents from different parties who still speak very eloquently and try to do the right thing on the environment. But yeah, the hard thing is the minute they do that, somehow the popularity at home tends to be in trouble.
I told this story last night, and just since you mentioned Macron and we were talking about Mia Motley, literally last year, in Paris, we had this event, right? 20,000 activists. Okay. Mia had asked us to bring together Billie Eilish, and literally she spoke to Billie Eilish's mom and said, if you care about climate change, you got to stand up for those nations on the front lines of climate change. There's this big summit Macron is organizing. And there we were in Paris the night before, 20,000 people. And I remember Mia Motley, she had RJ Banga. It was his 19th day in the job. He wanted to burnish his climate credentials. And I still remember her saying, you know what? Macron's done the right thing here, and I know he's really unpopular. And she said, I'm going to go out and thank him publicly. And I told this last night because I said, I don't think that's a good idea. Because literally it was the time cars were burning in the street. And she goes, no, because of that, I want people to know how we perceive him. And so sure enough, she got up on stage and she said, I want to begin by thanking President Macron. And sure enough, someone in the audience yells, Macron must resign. And they all started cheering. And Jill, I'm sure RJ was there being like, what's going on here? Like, you know. And I still remember how, I was like, well, how's she going to manage this? And somehow she challenged that audience. And she said, my friends, you know, that might be your view, but whether you like it or not, I went to United States, I went to the UK, and President Macron is the guy who responded and is actually doing something. Yeah. And whether you like it or not, that's our reality as small island nations. And I remember how these activists suddenly started applauding and was like, yeah, okay, you've got a point. And then RJ was like, yeah, okay, that's okay, and made his announcement. So anyway, I do remember that, and I think sometimes it's that courage to go against the orthodoxy. But it's a good point, yeah.
Thank you. We'll have one final question, please.
Right, thanks. Hi, so my name is Ada. My question is this: how do you see the landscape of social impact and innovation evolving in the coming years? And what opportunities do you foresee for change makers?
Do you guys want to take a pass at that first?
I'll go ahead and take it first. Thanks, Ada, for your question. I'm going to actually take a different approach to this question because I think that it's easy to talk about these opportunities, all of the positive, aspects, and sometimes not necessarily the harsh reality of the aspects. I'm one of those people who I'm like, let's go in head on. Mm-hmm. And so as I project to see some levels of continued polarization in our countries, both the U.S. and broadly, how are we looking at that? How are we engaging? How are we trying to mitigate that? And so with my community, with Black professionals in international affairs and broadly, we don't have the luxury to be able to bow out or to disengage, right? There's just too much at stake. So we don't have the luxury to disengage when Donald Trump gets elected. We don't have the luxury to disengage when we have Utah or Alabama progressing with anti-DEI laws, right? We don't have the luxury of disengagement when we have our leaders resigning from Ivy League institutions. Regression, this topic of how we engage in these hard realities, right? If we don't work to face them head on, we will eventually regress. And so I think that I give us a call to action, if you will, to not steer away from having to have the harder interactions, the harder conversations, to address the elephant in the room, to ask the hard questions, to just ask the questions, right? So even with BPIA and in broader work that I do, we're engaging stakeholders across the landscape. And that is an opportunity in itself, right? To push forward the progress of the DEI movement.
If I may add to that as well, too, I think that's a fantastic question on, where I think it's going to dramatically change, especially if we're looking at social impact and innovation. Why so is, if you look at the tactics of the old, tried and tested, naming and shaming, corporate social responsibility, lobbying, what have you. What you have now is you have an entirely almost new landscape because of the innovations that are coming out in the future, especially what we see with technology. And so that's where I think you're going to see massive change, especially in terms of the tactics, who we're targeting, as well as the different methodologies and approaches to reach those that we're trying to leverage. When you look at any good campaign, it's often just about leverage, finding those right points that Michael points out very well in his book. The old tactics will still be there and will still be effective where they make sense. But instead, we're embarking on a new realm of innovation this way. One of the things I look at as well too is, if any of you are familiar with the targeted sanctions movement, what most people don't know is that movement has resulted in huge gains on accountability for human rights and corruption. And so, the old approach when you're looking at these issues was to look at legislation, let's say, that you can pass, domestic reform, pressure, that kind of thing. But instead, you have accountability taking place where smart, creative communities and civil society are addressing obstacles, let's say, to civic space, to gender rights, to what have you, across a wide spectrum, and are able to effect change domestically as well as in a regional way through targeted sanctions that most people don't know about. And so that's what I see in terms of innovation. You're going to see a lot more change, new tactics, new approaches, and technology will really ride that revolution.
I know, and I can see, Julia, I want to be respectful to your logistics team, but there's that famous saying that says, no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. And I think just on that point of leverage, I actually remember this moment vividly, and it's where we first met in person. We had spoken before, but COP26 in Glasgow, and I remember there were thousands of people lining out because it was the first real big gathering post the pandemic, or still in the pandemic, but people gathering. And I always remember this argument that erupted in front of me of these two activists. And one of them said, here we are, we're all lining up and we're competing inside for the same panel discussions, the same slots, the same audiences against each other to influence the same people. And sure enough, once we got inside, there was a dozen or dozens of panel rooms, etc., and they had very few audiences, and it was one after the other kicking off on those panels. We were probably on a couple of them wondering, why are we here? and I remember the response from one of the, actually it wasn't an activist, it was the great Catherine Hayhoe, who I think is one of our best communicators on climate change. If you haven't read her book, it's called Saving Us. And she was actually there, and I remember she turned around and said, well, that's why we should be building our own platforms and figuring out what our strengths are, or if not, how to leverage the platforms of others. And she said, that's why I spend more time talking to Rotary clubs in, say, the South about climate change than I do coming to UN climate talks. And so for me, it's something I always keep in the back of my mind. And I think even our work at Global Citizen, that reiterated to me, well, that's our strength, is working with others to create new platforms, lifting up leaders to do that. But it's a very good comment.
Well, I want to invite everyone to continue the questions and the conversation in the lobby, where we'll have a reception. And it's a special opportunity for you to get an autographed copy of Michael's book. And thank you all for joining us tonight for a conversation on ideas to impact, and a special thank you to our esteemed panelists.